And it's an attack. It's an attack on you. But a lot of people won't get it. A lot of people will sell their Bitcoin in a panic. Boy, is it a corrupt system. And this will come for the Treasury companies. The vultures will take everything they can. This is a criminal network that has more powerful than government. You can't be a president unless you bow down to this network. The debt-based Ponzi scheme to prop up the dollar, to print GDP, create crimes against humanity in order to push the stock market up. What we are witnessing today has been done time after time after time. It was a mafia. It was terrorism. The dollar is a proof of weapons network. And there are these nodes which are now coming home, which no longer can be propped up. And that's the change that we're witnessing right now. Saudi is buying Bitcoin. Iran, Russia, China, most of them have figured it out, by the way. They're just not telling you. In the West, there's nothing sustainable about it right now. But the point of the tariff policy is that it was to reset the world order, and that's why they installed Trump. It's a lie. Everything's a lie. Archie. That is why that was one of the things. So my father passed away on the day that Celsius closed. And so I remember that time, Alex Maszynski actually contacted me during that time because I'd worked on the Bitfinex hack recovery, which was another bankruptcy deal we'd done. And we helped all the victims because 120,000 Bitcoin were hacked from the exchange. And we put together a construct that prevented it having to go into bankruptcy. And it was an amazing deal. Like all of the Bitfinex share, they ended up with shares in the company, a share of dividends of all the future profits. Ended up creating Tether, which changed the world, quite frankly, in this stablecoin world. And I was very proud of that deal because we managed to get the victims a lot of money back because they lost their Bitcoin, which now that Bitcoin is part of the Bitcoin strategic reserves. It's meant to come back to Bitfinex shareholders. That's our Bitcoin. So we're still trying to we're competing with the US government that's trying to steal it after the hack, which shows you what their strategy is. It's to confiscate Bitcoin. So Maszynski contacted me saying, can you help me in this bankruptcy? And as soon as I asked a few questions, I realized he's not disclosing the fraud. And there were many, many pensioners in that had lost their entire life savings. And so it kind of was this moment that distracted me from the fact that my father had lost his pension, got me into Bitcoin and on this path and journey. And so I saw my father as that pensioner that had lost all his Bitcoin. And so I obsessed over just dedicating 2 years to seeing if we could get the best outcome for those creditors. Obviously, I was a creditor as well, so I had self-interest, but just working with all of these pensioners to make sure there were two outcomes that we got in the bankruptcy. The first one was I stood in front of Judge Glenn and the creditor committee and got them not to sell the Bitcoin, which was the first time that's ever happened. In FTX, they sold Bitcoin at $16,000, all of the Bitcoin, and $1 billion was paid to lawyers. Now, the Bitcoin was at the bottom of the market around about this time. It went through the FTX crash, kept the Bitcoin all the way through. And then there was an interesting thing that happens in these bankruptcy, because what they do is they don't say you've lost 10 Bitcoin. They say you've lost 10 Bitcoin at the dollar price when the company goes into bankruptcy. And so you don't have a Bitcoin claim. And this is the bank strategy. This is the Treasury strategy. You don't have a Bitcoin claim anymore. You have a dollar claim at the bottom of the market after an elaborate pump and dump scheme. And so the bankruptcy estate kept the Bitcoin because we managed to persuade the judge not to sell it. But we all had a dollar claim. And so imagine your Bitcoin has crashed from, I think it was $69,000 to $17,000 in that cycle. FTX got the right at the bottom. And so all of the FTX creditors if they had one Bitcoin, they now owed $17,000, while the lawyers are just spending $1 billion of all the client money on the bankruptcy.
Looking for a secure, trusted way to buy, sell, and hold Bitcoin? Gemini has been leading the way since 2014. Founded by the Winklevoss twins to be a security-first, fully regulated Bitcoin platform. With Gemini, your Bitcoin is protected with enterprise-grade security, backed by insurance and Type 2 certifications for SOC 1 and SOC 2. Whether you're new to Bitcoin or a long-time hodler, Gemini gives you the tools to stack sats and build generational wealth your way. From simple one-tap buys to advanced charts and trading features, it's all here. Buy, sell, and hold securely. That's Gemini. Gemini. Bitcoin with confidence. Need cash without selling your Bitcoin? With DeBiFi, you borrow against your Bitcoin, non-custodial, multi-sig escrow, and you keep your keys. No banks, no selling, just institutional grade liquidity with terms up to 2 years and APRs as low as 9%. All transactions are signed using private keys on your own device. Using a 3 of 4 multi-sig setup, 3 out of 4 keys must approve every transaction, giving you control, transparency, and peace of mind. Whether you're a hodler, miner, small business, or treasury team, DeBiFi gives you the cash you need now without giving up your Bitcoin upside or triggering a taxable event. Get liquidity, keep exposure, and stay secure. That's DeBiFi. DeBiFi, your Bitcoin, your money.
We kept the Bitcoin, but an interesting thing happens. Once you get past, so imagine you've got a $17,000 claim and the price of Bitcoin's going up and up and up. Eventually, the price of Bitcoin, they lost 80% of the Bitcoin, 75% of the Bitcoin gone. We only had 25% left of the Bitcoin. But as the price goes up, the value that you can be repaid in dollars, with the price of Bitcoin going up, suddenly you got 50% of the dollar money and then 75%. But once you get to 100%, the rest of the money goes to other creditors, shareholders, and other types of stuff. So we had 2 years and the price started approaching 100%. And I was like, okay, once it gets to 100%, they're going to sell all the Bitcoin, or they're going to pay it out to others and keep the Bitcoin, and all the value goes to someone else. And they had the Canadian pension fund as a shareholder that was ultra sophisticated, invested 24 million in legal fees to make sure they were on top of everything. And the plan that was put forward to get out of bankruptcy was an awful plan. It was the worst type of plan. But I had to appeal to the judge and say, right, we got to get out before Bitcoin hits $55,000. Because once it hits $55,000, they're going to steal our money, even though we lost 75% of our Bitcoin. We end up with 25% of the Bitcoin, but the dollar value had approached 100%. And so we managed to get them out of the bankruptcy just before it hit like 97% of the value. And then the judge approved, we'll get you out of the plan. And there were a bunch of, all of the professional investors were putting all of their money to it, fighting it to try and just ride it out as long as possible, because then they could steal some of the value of the creditors' Bitcoin. And so, we got out right on time. And then everybody ended up receiving a Bitcoin payout. And to me, it was, I just wanted to get those pensioners whose life had been ruined, some suicides, some people had left, moved to different countries in South America because they could no longer afford to live in America. But I wanted to get as much value back for those pensioners as I could. And boy, is it a corrupt system. Like it is. Those bankruptcies, and this will come for the treasury companies, when you're involved in one of those bankruptcies, the wolves come out. The vultures will take everything they can, and they will sell all those assets to someone in the club, in the proof of weapons network, a vulture capitalist. They'll end up with all your assets and all the upside, and it is 100. And the lawyers are incentivized to long it out as long as possible, because they can now legally spend client money. They can do what SBF did, but legally, because in the Chapter 11 process, they just take client money and say, we'll spend our bill, we'll cover our bills. And in the FTX, they're still going now. They took $1 billion in legal fees, and they still keep going. It is a scam on a scam on a scam, and it is the biggest grift. So when you find yourself in one of those things, you realize this system is it is corrupt beyond corrupt. There's no consideration of the pensioners or who the victims are in this process. It is just a feeding ground for vultures.
So in a bankruptcy, there's a hierarchy of claims. If any of these Bitcoin treasury companies go bankrupt, the equity holders will be wiped out, and it will be the debt holders, the bond holders, who will be fighting for seniority then.
Yeah, so you have debt holders first, and then equity last. And then you have the very sophisticated people that have put together these corporate debt instruments and invested. I mean, they know every trick under the sun, and they're the same people, the same company that will be doing these IPOs will be constructing the corporate debt. And they know who their clients are. Their clients are the institutions. They're not the retail, and we know that Wall Street can coordinate, and we know that they control governments, and we know that they control monetary policy and fiscal policy. They're on the top of the chain. They're a mafia, and they don't care about you. They don't care about you. And they are using their financial weapons of mass destruction in order to financialize, securitize, and tokenize everything. And it's an attack. It's an attack on you. Now, fortunately, Bitcoin proof of work means that it doesn't necessarily matter. But a lot of people won't get it. A lot of people will sell their Bitcoin in a panic. And I think that brings us full circle. It's the psyche, it's the psychology of you are in a race to accumulate Bitcoin against Wall Street, and you need to get as much Bitcoin as you can, and you need to hold it in self-custody. And the lower the price over the next 5 years, the more Bitcoin you're going to end up with.
So what do you think will be the lowest price over the next 5 years? Do you think we're at it right now?
I've learned enough to not try and predict prices. I've never been a good trader. Every time I've tried to trade, I've messed it up. And I've learned all those lessons. And so I just have fundamental principles. No leverage, no debt, no deviating from Bitcoin. And I've deviated. I've done everything I teach you is because I've done them all. I've made all the mistakes. All right. And, I want more simplicity in my life, because knowing that I don't need to trade, I don't need to watch charts, I don't need to do any of that stuff. All I need to do is just own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month and learn self-custody. That is what everybody needs to do. And everybody's focusing on whether they should buy a shitcoin first, whether they should do it through Treasury, whether they should borrow against it, and all the sophisticated stuff. If you're going to do the sophisticated stuff, do it with a small percentage of your Bitcoin once you've got enough Bitcoin. And now I remember where we are, to come full circle. The time to sell your Bitcoin to enjoy life, because that is what life is about. We are on this earth to do more, and Bitcoiners need to do more, because the ones that have Bitcoin in self-custody, you are going to be, I believe, in the future, if you do this right, part of an elite class. And people are going to hate you because you're rich, most likely. And people are going to have conspiracy theories. You're going to be the future Rothschilds when Wall Street does their shit with their Bitcoin and you have it in self-custody. You're going to be the one that's contributing to lobbies in the future to try and influence politics. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. We're humans. We go through this cycle. But those that end up with the Bitcoin, you are going to have to contribute to society, and life is going to, I predict that we're going to end up in a world of universal basic income, those that ended up with all the assets, and those that ended up with Bitcoin in self-custody. These will be the three classes of people in this artificial intelligence world that we're going to. Everybody should be in here. Everybody can be in here. And when do you sell your Bitcoin to enjoy it? So I said the worst investment I ever made was 1,000 Bitcoin for a house, but it fulfilled a different need for me. It was security, in a place where there's no crime, and I could secure myself and my family and know that I don't have to borrow from the bank ever again. There is no bank, there is no VC, there is no Wall Street that can censor my speech. Because when you're a public company, you can't talk like I talk. And if I had venture capital funding and I said, hey, I really care about this stuff, the venture capitalist is going to say, no, focus. So it is a form of censorship. Taking a loan from a bank means you are partially owned by the bank. Taking any of this different, it is a control mechanism and is well understood. And so at some point, you're going to want to sell some of your Bitcoin. You're either going to do it as part of a well-managed borrow against your Bitcoin. Personally, I don't do that. I did it once and I'll never do it again. But at least it was less than 1% of my Bitcoin. So it made no difference to me financially. It was just an interesting experience for me. For others, it was life devastating. So you're either going to borrow against your Bitcoin, then please manage that and think that the Bitcoin in custody will be lost if it goes wrong. And so manage accordingly. Or you're going to sell your Bitcoin. The time to sell your Bitcoin is when you still have enough Bitcoin after the sale. Never reset yourself. So don't say, I managed to get a Bitcoin and now it's $115,000 and I want to buy a house. You sell your Bitcoin and you're back to zero. You need to adjust your time preference of those delayed gratifications around ensuring that the ratio of the Bitcoin that you sell is reasonable. So everyone will have a different ratio, but just as far away from 100% is where you want to be. And so for me, I could sell 1,000 Bitcoin because it was a percentage of the Bitcoin I'd accumulated that was reasonable, that even if the 1,000 Bitcoin, the 1,000 Bitcoin is gone, then I've still got enough Bitcoin that I think is life-changing. And just pick a price of where you think Bitcoin will be in the future. Maybe you think it's going to be $1 million in 10 years. I think that's ultra conservative. And then just think about how much Bitcoin you need to maintain as you take it off. And the lower the percentage, if you're selling 5% of your Bitcoin in order to buy a house, screw it. You still got 95% of your Bitcoin. It will be the worst investment you ever made. But what is life for? We're all going to die, and we're going to pass our Bitcoin on to somebody. Most people are going to not even get their inheritance right, and it's just going to disappear and help other Bitcoiners. But we are here we are here on life in order to make a difference. And if you've done this right and you delayed gratification, then you're going to want to live in a certain level of comfort. And so think about my final thing on that is think about the percentage of your Bitcoin that you're going to take off the table so that you still have enough Bitcoin after the purchase.
It's my firm belief that the road to the next crypto crash is paved with yield. And I already see there's quite a lot of, yield never really disappeared from the non-Bitcoin space, despite the catastrophe of the last bear market. So it feels like there's no way that once Wall Street starts offering those products that people are going to be able to resist. Why can't people resist the temptation?
Because people need to manage, right? So Bitcoin created a growth asset, and people need income not to sell their growth asset. So people try to figure out how to solve the income problem. And that's a hard problem for people to solve, particularly Bitcoiners. And so they try and say, I get my Bitcoins growing, but as long as I can do something with it to generate income, I'm still going to end up with the same amount of Bitcoin. And that's the exact same thing that ends up with you putting all of your Bitcoin on a Celsius or the Wall Street equivalent in the future. And so people need to figure out what their income strategy is. And they need to do some financial planning here. And so most people will have something that generates fiat income, and eventually it needs to be spending less than you bring in, and the rest going into Bitcoin. And then eventually people will say, right, I'm done now with my fiat income once they hit a certain level of wealth. And then you need to replace the income with something else. And so the mistake I think people make is they try and earn yield on their Bitcoin, and then they go 100% in, rather than saying, here's the money in the bank is my spending money. Fiat currency is the best spending money, by the way. If your rent is in pounds or dollars, then you want pounds or dollars. You don't want volatility to figure out how to pay your rent in a month. Anything can happen to the price of Bitcoin or any asset within a month. And so fiat currency is, spending. Bitcoin introduces saving. And then think of anything else as investing. And so if you take some of your Bitcoin and earn yield on it, you have declassified it from saving and reclassified it as investing. And investing means you're trying to outperform Bitcoin, which will either be paying yield or ending up in a higher, riskier investment. But reclassify it from saving and investing. What people do is they classify their savings as investments. They think of Bitcoin as an investment rather than separating their saving and investing. So you need spending, which is your expenses without currency risk. Then you got saving, which is an asset that you're going to be okay to hold for a minimum of 4 years. And then you got investing, which is trying to outperform your savings. And so yield is something you can do, but recognize that you are taking massive risk and reclassifying your savings as investing. And so people play those games, but they never actually come up with a plan. Most people are trying to get rich within a year. And if you're trying to get as rich as possible within a year, you're going to end up going into a shitcoin saying, what's the next Bitcoin? And you're going to end up doing something to try and multiply it, and you'll end up with yield or something. Everyone goes there. So they end up with meme coins, ICOs, DeFi, smart contracts on smart contracts on smart contracts, where they end up, because if only they said, what is my plan for the next 5 to 10 years? And everyone's got a plan for the next year, and you're probably not going to make it in the next year. You got 5 years. Put together a 5-year plan today, and anybody that ends up with more Bitcoin every month for the next 5 years, I personally believe you're going to be in a class of people that is significantly higher than your current class.
You mentioned Bitcoin to $1 million within 10 years is extremely conservative. What is a target addressable market, and where is the money going to come from? Well,
so I believe in the end, anybody that wants freedom needs Bitcoin in self-custody. That was our first, different cycle. And what is the future? So we've done this whole corporate stuff with treasuries that's produced a constant bid and took Bitcoin to a $2 trillion asset. Once you hit a $2 trillion asset, you're in a different class of investor. Now,
who are they?
Well, institutional investors that, they couldn't look at an asset without this level of liquidity and this level of market cap. You've got sovereigns, and then you've got those that are trying to escape an IMF cycle like El Salvador, or you've got those that have surplus reserves and sovereign wealth. And then you've got those that are trying to do debt gymnastics like America. You've got debt gymnastics, escape, and sovereign wealth. All of those are sold by Bitcoin. And all of them at some stage, and most of them have figured it out, by the way, they're just not telling you.
Oh, you think so?
Absolutely.
How are they buying it? Are they mining it with excess, gas that they would otherwise flare? Or
yes.
You think that's one of the ways?
All of the above. I mean, if you're an energy country, Iran is obviously doing a lot more with Bitcoin than most people know.
I'd throw Russia into that as well.
Russia you'd be suicidal not to. They're not going to tell you. But you can look at the hash power and estimate where it's coming from. It's something like 11%, I think, is Russia at the moment. I think 40% is America. About 20% is China. I think Iran, you could estimate between 2% and 6%. UAE has just started, satellite imagery has just started disclosing, their Citadel, a sovereign wealth fund backed mining operations.
Hang on. What?
Yeah, you can get a satellite and see the UAE mining operations.
Where has that been reported or disclosed? Because that's fascinating.
It must have come on your Twitter feed. You haven't done that?
No.
You cover everything.
I've missed that. So like a satellite imagery of their Bitcoin, specifically saying that they're mining Bitcoin.
Yes. So they've already mined 6,000 Bitcoin disclosed.
Is this was this revealed in a group chat that I'm not a part of or something? Do I need to get into some more WhatsApp groups or something like that? I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that at all.
I'm incredibly surprised that it passed you because you see everything. So
I do see everything.
Look it up. And then, you've got the Kingdom of Bhutan's, the highest Bitcoin per capita rate in the world. Interestingly, Bhutan is an interesting case study. Max talks about El Salvador and Bhutan, and GDP as a measure is an economic trick that is utilized because America measures GDP, which doesn't measure the K-shaped economy or wealth inequality. The Kingdom of Bhutan has actually got the highest number of Bitcoin per capita and also measures happiness as their measure of GDP. So they have a happiness index.
As a measure of national success rather than economic GDP, it's happiness.
Absolutely, because GDP doesn't factor in that it's a smaller and smaller number of people that end up creating all the GDP and the government is printing all the money. Like the American economy is just print money, send it to Pentagon, create war, and send that money over to the companies that pumps up the stock market, buy technology, this is the level that the economy is at the moment.
It's a single figure for the whole nation. But if you're not participating in parts of the economy and you don't have assets which are benefiting from the money printing, you're not taking any share of that increase in GDP economic activity. You're still trying to earn a living with suppressed wages that barely catch up to inflation. I mean, we've seen the effects of that in the UK since the global financial crisis, where, inflation has run amok just in the last 5 years. I think it's around about 40%. But wages have certainly not gone up by 40% in 5 years. Not for the average person, perhaps for the executive class. Probably. I haven't looked into those figures, but certainly not for the average person, earning under £100,000. Which is considered, strangely, quite a high salary in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, last time I looked, I think the average executive of a public company is getting a minimum of $16 million per year on average. And then obviously when you're in the Magnificent Seven or you're in the JP Morgans or the Wall Street, you're blowing that out. And all of the value, almost, the stock market and the economy have completely decoupled now. All of the consumption in an economy is the wealthiest 10%. The wealthiest 10% own 90% of the stocks. And virtually all of the money through the debt-based Ponzi scheme for fiscal dominance is trying to increase the GDP through subsidized revenue, which translates into stock price that you can then borrow against at a significantly cheaper rate than anyone that's spending on credit cards in order to pump the stock again. So you've got this debt capital markets, equity capital markets, money printing, real estate, and this is all the financial industrial complex as one big circle of increasing wealth. But because it's done on government printing, and issuance of bonds and bond auctions, everyone else, if you don't have assets, you're paying. You know, we're all paying collectively through inflation, but their assets are beating inflation. And these people don't have any assets. You know, and not only that, they're paying the highest interest rate. They're paying the 30% interest rate for their payday loan and credit card. And they can't make next month's rent. And they're the people that are on YouTube right now freaking out in their car, you know, worried about whether they need to go back into shoplifting again. You know, you see all these videos. But GDP says, and Trump will say, the economy is the best it's ever been. You know, and these people are being gaslit. You know, these people are struggling. You know, in the West, the system that we've converted, there's nothing sustainable about it right now. And we are going full-blown fiscal dominance, which is perpetuate that further. You know, that only leads to one outcome: civil unrest. You can't have a small number of people owning everything, and these people homeless, addicted to drugs. And look at the statistics across the board. Record wealth inequality, record drug addiction, record homelessness, record crime rates, record pornography addiction, record number of people that are choosing prostitution and OnlyFans as their way of earning money, record degeneracy, you know, the lowest birth rates. People can't afford to have children. They're not having children. You know, and what does a corporate like BlackRock say? Oh, right. If we are not getting, the West isn't having any children. You know, they've gone to war. They've come back. They didn't get any goods. They came back addicted to drugs from all the PTSD from the war we sent them to. And now they're homeless and they're looking like a zombie. And they're on the drugs that the CIA do. These are all government level, you know, drug operations, human trafficking, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking. I mean, come on, stop pretending that this is like a war that the government's trying to stop. Trump knows that it's the CIA that run all these operations. How do you think they get all their money for these black op operations? It's their drug dealing. That's what the CIA was set up for in the first place. And that sits under the military industrial complex. So if BlackRock wants to wage a war, you contact Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin contacts the CIA. They send some money through USAID. They fund some training camps of, you know, people that they call the terrorists. They engineer civil unrest campaign in a country. They then steal all the resources through a group like M23 in Congo, through Rwanda, that then makes the components for our iPhones. And then you come in and say, oh, we're trying to tackle the drug issue here. You know, when you realize how this actually all fits together, you realize that the debt-based Ponzi scheme in this K-shaped economy is destroying nations where they've never been able to capitalize on their vast wealth, like Africa, the global south, the Middle East. You know, the countries that managed to escape it had to partner with the debt-based Ponzi scheme, i.e. the petrodollar. You know, Saudi only got there because they were forced into the petrodollar. And even America stole 50% of all their oil all the way until they were powerful enough to break free. Iran decided not to do that, so they were on the wrong side of British Petroleum, so they had their government overthrown. You know, the CIA and MI6 just took out the government when they wanted to nationalize their oil and say, we're not going to give our people tax, we're just going to nationalize the oil so that we can have free markets without having to give 60%. You know, Africa is not able to use their resources. They have to mine them and just hand them over, or they get M23'd or ISIS or Al Qaeda'd, you know, which is intelligence operations funding these different campaigns. And then they create fake wars on terrors or say China's the enemy, communism is the enemy, is the radical left. Now they're doing it internal. They're saying Antifa's the enemy. You know, you're the terrorists, you radical lefts, you're the enemy. We're going to use this on you. You know, and this is all engineered through this elaborate debt-based Ponzi scheme to prop up the dollar, to print GDP in order to push the stock market up. And not only is it causing all of the issues globally, because now the global hegemon can't prop up, it's created this proof of weapons network that says, hey, screw it. There's not enough birth rates in the West. Let's build up Africa because we need some labor, and let's build up artificial intelligence and robotics because we can't rely upon the humans anymore. So we'll rejig the game. We'll create some wars over here. We'll tell the politicians to do this. We'll buy Congress in order to push this narrative. We'll fund the media in order to push out this bullshit. And wash, rinse, repeat. And what are we seeing right now in Gaza? All of a sudden, 2 years, take down the entire Gaza, knock down all the buildings, profit from genocide. And now suddenly there's a plan. What is the plan? It is to tokenize the land that was stolen from the Palestinians, turn it into a shitcoin, so that they can launch a digital ID and build a Palantir Orwellian nightmare so that they can beta test the 15-minute smart cities that they want to put on their own people when civil unrest comes home. And Israel is just a mechanism for testing genocide as a service and occupation as a service, recruiting an army based upon radicalizing religion, as all colonies have always done. They think they're fighting a religious battle. They fund all sides of all the conflicts.
But the interesting thing about that is Israel insists that Hamas are religious fundamentalists, and that's what's driving their animus towards Jews, supposedly. Hamas is insisting we have no problem with Jews. I mean, we've heard many of their spokespeople insist on that and make the distinction between Zionism through Israel and Jews in general. Why do you think Israel insists that it is Islamic fundamentalism?
So America would have you believe, the power structure would have you believe that Israel rules the world. And there is a very elaborate conspiracy theory that says Jews rule the world, based upon a narrative that was pushed during the Nazi regime. Now, by the way, we'll go back a bit and then we'll come back. Remind me if I get lost on this, try and bring me back to that question. The Federal Reserve was implemented in 1913. It was based upon the model that was implemented in the Bank of England. The Bank of England, 1694, was to fund both sides of the French and British War and take over the issuance of the pound through an elaborate debt-based Ponzi scheme, which made the foundation of the model. And so the Bank of England funded both sides, and you ended up with the Napoleon, which was a resistance against the central bankers, because he ended up funding the war through selling Louisiana to America because he didn't want to take on any debt. And you end up with this model that was perpetuated. We did all the colonial expeditions. We stole the tea from India in order to get all their gold. We did the Opium War in China in order to steal all of China's silver. We did the raping and pillaging of all the African countries, created the transatlantic slave trade, built our economy based upon that. How did we do it? We did it through currency debasement and inflation. We did it in America. What people talk about the Boston Tea Party. There were 3 central banks in America, and the Boston Tea Party, the revolution, was not just about the tax. It was about that we debased, that we actually printed their fake currency and flooded the economy through inflation in order to destroy the economy so we could take down the local banks. This has always been what we are witnessing today, has been done time after time after time. So then in 1913, you get the installation of the Federal Reserve under very questionable things. You read the Creature from Jekyll Island if you want to understand, how that came to be. You have the Warburg family that were both the governor of the Federal Reserve and also the Reichsbank in Germany. In 1914, you have World War I. During World War I, Wall Street via the nodes on this proof of weapon network from the Federal Reserve, which gave the ownership of this private bank to all the banks that could print the money every time you issue a loan. They end up firstly creating this debt-based Ponzi scheme within America, which I would call fake capitalism, that did exactly what it did to England. England had no debt. Then the Bank of England was formed, funded a war, and then you bankrupted it right up until World War I through all these colonial expeditions. The wealthy in the Dutch East India Company end up with all the gold and all the assets through mercantilism. So now you've got a bankrupted England, and they say the Bank of England is no longer useful to us. Let's stick all the gold in America. So let's create the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve then starts its scheme to take a country that had very low debt and turn it into $37 trillion that it is today. Ever since the Federal Reserve, in 1914, you had World War I. America never left World War I. They have been in a continual state of war ever since the formation of the Federal Reserve. Whether it be 100 different covert wars, whether it be the Cold War, whether it be the Korean War, the Vietnamese War, the fake war on terror, which they engineered, all of the Middle Eastern wars, all of the all of the African wars, all of the Latin American wars, continual, never stop. What we are witnessing in Gaza has been done covertly without you seeing it on camera, time and time again. That Bank of England to today, there were studies done that estimate 200 million people have died from the Bank of England to today in continual state of wars. Now, what happened in 1914? You created fake capitalism in America based upon a debt-based Ponzi scheme. You also funded the Bolshevik Revolution, which overthrew the Russian Tsar and replaced it with the Soviet communist regime. And you also funded, through the Bank for International Settlements, Nazi Germany and fascism. If you look at the funding, it's absolutely fascinating. I recommend reading a book called Tower of Basel. And it goes through, and this is
Tower of Babel?
Basel.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. And Tower of Babel is obviously, it comes from that, religious theological concept. And then they said Tower of Basel because the Swiss banks. Now, if you look at the history of the Bank for International Settlements, it was the bank that had no reserve, but was connected to the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve and the Swiss Central Bank. So you could store your gold at either the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, or the Swiss Central Bank. And the Bank for International Settlements was a ledger. And that ledger would say who the gold belongs to on a piece of paper in a drawer at one of those central banks. And so when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, the Bank for International Settlements would contact the Reichsbank and say, hey, this is now our gold. And they would take the gold in the drawer at the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve and change a label and say, this is now Hitler's gold. This is Germany's gold. And Hitler funded the war through National Socialism, which was a labor-backed currency. He arrested the Rothschilds. But the Bank for International Settlement would use the Reichsbank in order to reclassify the gold that would back this labor-backed currency. And so this was an expedition to accumulate as much gold as possible so that the Bank for International Settlement could trade the label on the drawer and change the private key. Germany ended up with all of this gold. You obviously had the Great Depression that led to, into World War II as well. That was the confiscation of all Americans' gold, at $35. You had the bankruptcy of the colonial expedition, and World War II was the mechanism for taking all of the gold from Britain and the colonial side, reset through currency, that all of that gold ended up at Fort Knox. Okay? So now you got all of Germany's gold at the end of World War II, or a chunk of it. You've got a big chunk of the Russian gold through communism, and you've got all the colonial mercantilism gold, and you've got the Federal Reserve fake capitalism. 75% of the world's gold ended up in Fort Knox. And what did America have? It created the manufacturing base to manufacture weapons of mass destruction using financial weapons of mass destruction. So they used finance in order to engineer creating all of those wars, selling all of the weapons, and then it took you into World War II. And what was the end of World War II? Right, we have 75% of all the gold. Everyone is bankrupt. We've just got the Soviet Union, which we funded. And so now we profit from capitalism, fascism, and communism. And we can fund every side. So what do? We fund the Cold War. And what is needed in order to build these financial weapons of mass destruction? Okay, so firstly, let's meet at Bretton Woods. And the first thing we need to do is persuade every single country that will sign up for this to have their currency no longer gold-backed, but convertible to the dollar. And then we've got all the gold in Fort Knox, so if ever you want, you can change your currency. You can buy dollars and then we'll give you some gold. And it created this eternal bid on the dollar. So everybody said, all right, yeah, fine. We can sell our currency. We can print our currency, sell our currency, buy dollars. And you know what? When we've got our dollars, we probably want some yield on it. And so what will we do? We'll lend it back to you. We'll buy some treasuries. And in America had this revolving bank account. They call it a dollar milkshake theory, where it would suck up the world's gold, inflate away everyone else's currencies, everyone else's savings. They would go through severe inflation. And then they would create an organization that could send financial weapons of mass destruction around the world, the World Bank and the IMF. So now you had the Bank for International Settlements, you had the IMF, you had the World Bank. What they did is they went to every country and destroyed their currency through currency manipulation, made them print their currency and buy treasuries. And if you didn't do it, we'll fund a colored revolution and overthrow your government and replace it with a government that's right for us. And once you are a government, you will buy our weapons. You must buy our weapons, and you must price all your goods in dollars. And if you don't do that, you're going and will blow up your country. It was a mafia. It was terrorism. And every good that you produce, you must produce in dollars. And by the way, when you have resources, you can't produce your own goods. You need to give us the resources, and we'll take all of this vast investment in our treasuries, and we'll build our own technical industrial complex, financial industrial complex, military industrial complex, consumption industrial complex. And we'll make you buy as many weapons, and if you don't buy them, we'll sanction you and destroy your economy. And then that will destroy the wealth of all the people, and then they can execute a colored revolution, a covert regime, 100 different operations since World War II. 100 times. And they pretend, oh, this is for religion. This is because we're civilizing the world. This is because we're, we care that you're a dictator and we want to replace it with democracy, even though they were replacing democracies with dictators in the case of Iran. And so they would fool the world into this scheme, but they had all the gold. And through this mechanism, you ended up with the military-industrial complex. Who were the military-industrial complex? It was companies that would take the Pentagon budgets and build the vast military and create GDP by just chucking out money from all these sucked up dollars on a debt-based Ponzi scheme that would then build a manufacturing base and make sure that we don't get bombed, but we can bomb everyone else. Now we need continual war. So you have the Cold War. You say, well, capitalism versus communism. The communists are about to get us. We've got to get the commies. The commies are about to take over Afghanistan, which happens to have all the poppy seeds for all the drugs that the CIA needs. Who were the CIA? The CIA were, through Operation Paperclip, the Nazi Germans that came over and joined the CIA.
So just a little bit. After World War II, there was an operation to repatriate Nazi scientists who were among the leaders in the world in all sorts of fields to America, and they were given, I guess they were exonerated for their crimes if they actually came and worked in America for the American military-industrial complex.
Exactly. Now, what did they pretend that the CIA was there for? They said it's for national security. No, the CIA was always for corporate interest and waging war for corporate profits from day one. There was a 10% that might be national security, but 90% was, if you want a company to get the resources that it needs, i.e. originally it was like the Banana Republic and the banana, trade in Central and South America, then we will exert a regime change through the CIA, and the negotiation will get you everything you want, and we'll put a puppet in charge, that gives us everything we want. And the CIA was a partnership between those Nazi scientists to build the military-industrial complex, and then they needed the security and the finance. The security was the Italian mafia, which was a faction of power in America at the time, and it was the Jewish mafia. Now, when I say that, there's this word Jewish that people suddenly think you're talking about all Jews and you're anti-Semitic. Just like I say Italian mafia, there is a group of Italians that were in the mafia, and there were 99% of Italians that weren't the mafia. So when I say Jewish mafia, there was a Jewish mafia as a faction of power in America.
When they called mobbing, this is well established and well documented. It's not a figment of someone's imagination. There did exist ethnic factions within the underworld and crime factions, and one of them was Italian. Obviously, another faction was Jewish as well in America.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you combine those all together and you have the CIA. Now they need money. What did they do? If you want to understand how they created the money laundering network that still exists today, they'll tell you that it doesn't. Read a book by Paul Williams called Operation Gladio. It was done through the Vatican Bank, the Italian mafia connection. And so the Vatican Bank was created a banking operation which would get 15% of all the revenue from the crimes that they were committing. And those crimes were human trafficking, weapons trafficking, drugs trafficking, and sex trafficking. And all of those were happening, and it created a black operation, a fund that existed outside Congress where you could commit crimes against humanity. And then they put nodes of this proof of weapons network all around the world. There's one in, Ukraine is one of them that separated Europe and Russia. Taiwan is another one that separated China and Western interest. Another one was South Korea during the Korean War that separated, Korea, North Korea, and other parts. And one of them was Israel. And so during World War I, when the UK and Winston Churchill were bankrupt and needed to fund World War I and transfer all the gold over to Fort Knox in America eventually, they took loans from the Zionists, and the Zionists in exchange said that we will give you a Jewish state in Palestine, we'll plonk you on top of Palestine, and that was our promise to you, and it was declared to Walt Rothschild. And so Walt Rothschild had that declaration. World War I ends in 1918, then we have the Great Depression in between, confiscation of gold, then we have World War II, then we have the creation of the CIA, which was a replica of MI6, and the British intelligence from the British Empire. Then you have deals that were signed between the Zionists and the Nazi regime to take 60,000 German Jews and plonk them in Palestine. Now, immigrants were welcome at the time. Like there was, at that time, it was previously the Ottoman Empire, and then Britain, through its colonial expeditions, had occupation. And then we entered into this territory. And they basically just started pushing Jewish people, mainly from prior to fleeing the Holocaust and then after the Holocaust. And then they would commit terrorism all around the region so that all the Jewish people would believe that they're in fear and that they, you know, from all their history and persecution. And when you joined Israel, which started on terrorism, Haganah, all of these groups, look them up on Wikipedia. They basically did all these false flag operations, covert operations, in order to make it look like the Egyptians did it, but it was them that did it. You know, so that they could blame them, escalate the war, and all of these different things when you look at that moment in history. But essentially, they needed, America and the British Empire needed a destabilization force to prevent the Arab countries ever unifying in an Arab League around their oil, because then they could compete with the dollar. And they needed oil to be priced in dollars, and they needed an army. And so they weaponized religion. They radicalized the evangelical Christians in America to believe you needed to protect Israel, the country, and the political regime, rather than Israel, the prophet, in the scriptures. And then you had this crazy thing where all the Jews were so scared that they'd go to Israel, and you had to join the IDF, and you'd have to engage in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians for a minimum of 3 years. And so you built an army. And this is an army that is radicalized into believing they're in a fight for survival, and therefore they need to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. This is still raging on today, but Israel became a weapon for the military-industrial complex. If you wanted to commit crimes against humanity, you just get Israel to do it. Follow the money. People say Israel rules the world, right? This is a plausible deniability story. Israel is a tiny economy relative to America, okay? They print the Pentagon budget based upon a narrative. It's the war on terror. It's the Iranians. It's the Iraqis. They got weapons of mass destruction. You know, they took down 9/11. They took down the towers. You know, whatever narrative they have to engineer, and they do engineer this, don't believe that they won't kill their own people. They will. It's the mafia. The mafia will do anything. That is who the CIA, that is who the deep state is. And it sits under military, and those military are public companies, and those public companies are tradable and controlled by the asset managers. BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, Morgan Stanley, all those. Okay? So that's where you are. You have this deep state, and they can create wars. And that is the proof of weapons network. You have these nodes all around. And now, right now, all of this Palantir technology that's coming home through border security, it's already been beta tested on the West Bank. All of the injections, they were beta tested. All of the drugs, they were beta tested on Africans. Like, this is a criminal network that has more powerful than government, that has budgets that sit outside any congressional or constitutional or democratic process, quote unquote democratic. And they run the shops. Governments, you can't be a president unless you bow down to this network. You're not allowed to play president. Like, people think Trump is like independent. No, you just have to look at his backers and what he's doing. Everything is building the technocratic nightmare, you know, doing the aggression in Israel, you know, and he is good as work for the banks and the financial institutions. He's been a very good boy for them. He's given them as much money as they need. And it's because they're in charge. And that's the same with the UK. That's the same with Australia. That's the same with Canada. That's the same with the European Union. Where did the European Union come? It was created by the Bank for International Settlements. It was their project. It was to turn Germany into, get rid of all those competing currencies, consolidate it into the European Union, have unelected officials and a European central bank and a single currency, so that you could essentially use organizations that were created after the Cold War, NATO, during the Cold War, NATO, and NATO would be a sales strategy for the military-industrial complex. You can see it right now in Ukraine. Keir Starmer is just sending $3 billion every year to Ukraine. That goes to an installed politician called Zelensky that was installed in 2014 as a result of a CIA covert regime change. The USAID is funding the BBC and all of the media to push out this narrative. We're told that we're defending democracy. They print the money. They take their cut off the top, and then it goes straight back into printing GDP for American companies and pushing up the stock market. And that's what they need to do to keep turning it over. They're doing the same in Palestine. The only reason things are changing right now is because there was a rising power called China that created a network called BRICS that circumvented sanctions, that allowed for oil to be priced in alternative currencies, that was immune to sanctions, and partnered with the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, and said, we're your most important customer now. We're buying oil, most of your oil, because America's got its own oil and it's energy independent now. And so therefore, why don't we align BRICS with China, SCOs, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and all of the exporting countries, ASEAN, Taiwan, Vietnam, Vietnam, Cambodia, all of these different exporting countries. And why don't we create a resistance movement against the dollar, which was called de-dollarization? And whose idea, who supported this? BRICS. Goldman Sachs did. Goldman Sachs hosted in America, which is not an America First company. It is a global institution that said BRICS is a good idea. And so it created that resistance against it and said, how do we reset the world order now? I know, let's put Trump in and let's do tariffs. Tariffs reset the world order, consolidated power just like COVID. I'm just going from beginning to end. I could give you a million stories in the middle, but we'd be here forever. But story after story after story is, in order to prop up the dollar, you need to create crimes against humanity to force people to print their currency, buy dollars, and lend it to the US government. Now, because of these regional blocks, and because the Proof of Weapons Network has said, these people aren't even having children anymore. They don't even have good birth rates. There's no good demographics. The country's completely divided and polarized. Let's bring it home and let's invest over there. And when we want to change everything, we'll just price our ETFs in another currency. Maybe we'll accumulate a bunch of Bitcoin. And maybe the moment that we need to, the Federal Reserve can reset the world order, just like they've done many, many times. And so currencies are the financial weapons of mass destruction. And the dollar is a proof of weapons network. And there are these nodes which are now coming home, which no longer can be propped up. And that's the change that we're witnessing right now. And if you want to try and figure out how to invest through that and beat BlackRock and beat JP Morgan and beat Goldman Sachs, you ain't going to do it. You're going to give them your money, and then that's how they accumulate their power. And that's what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is a boycott from the Federal Reserve by taking your money out of the system. It's a boycott from BlackRock by not getting them to own your Bitcoin. And it's a boycott from the banks by not having to take on debt, which is the engine of fiat currency. And then you can boycott them. You can boycott all these companies. You can spend local. You can look after your local farmers. You can spend from local trade routes. And that's what Bitcoin does. And that's why they don't want you to have Bitcoin in self-custody. They want you to own it through their ETF and borrow against it. And they'll engineer shitcoins, tokenization, and everything to try and get your Bitcoin.
You mentioned China organizing an alternative world order. I mean, the West would constantly compare itself or contrast itself with previously the Soviet Union, but of the last 30 years versus, against China. And the comparison was always, we've got capitalism, which drives efficiency, effectiveness, and we've got all these freedoms. And look at them over there. They've got communism, They can't make anything they copy, and they can only make things that are low value, high volume production. But it seems of late that we are edging more towards the authoritarian caricature that we put upon a nation like China, and don't do capitalism particularly well, and can't seem to build infrastructure on time, on budget. Whereas China is doing capitalism exceedingly well, and even outdoing the West when it comes to technical, scientific innovation. How do you see that?
America is nothing that, America is a PR. It is public relations. So we have a phrase in the anti-war Israel movement of every accusation is a confession, because everything they accuse you of is their confession. Like, they're doing everything that they're accusing. They're the ones doing the sexual violence. They're the ones doing the prisoners. They're the ones doing the terrorism. And there is a resistance movement against that. And there's all sorts of covert operations we could go through. The same is with America. In order to stop you focusing on this proof of weapons network, they told you it's the radical left, it's the communists, it's the LGBTQs, it's whatever ideology, it's the terrorists, it's the Islamists. Like, they'll come up with a new ist every time in order to say we need to go to war with them. But what they were preventing was competition. They wanted global hegemon, and the only resistance against that was the Soviet Union that they were benefiting from as well in the Wall Street coffers. And then eventually that fell, and then you had the global hegemon. And oil was priced in dollars as a result of that. So now you had this one force, and this one force cannibalized itself, because capitalism is code word. And again, I'm not anti-capitalist. I'm not any of these things. Capitalism and communism are fake ideologies. They're not real. There is no capitalist country in the world today. Like, you had it in the Islamic golden era where you had free trade, hard money, but you had layers of ethics on top of that. They took the layers of ethics and they took out the hard money and created a debt-based Ponzi scheme. And then Adam Smith created a book called The Wealth of Nations and said it was his work, when it was really the Islamic scholarly work that happened during the golden age of Islam. As with everything that was just, the books were destroyed, they put a new label on it and said, we created all this stuff. And so, you had this fake capitalism, which was a debt-based Ponzi scheme to extract wealth and take everyone to a totalitarian state. Inevitable, predictable, and guaranteed. If you create a system where the currency is debt and there's not enough money to pay the debt, then the only way to substitute it is through government debt. And then you get this elaborate scheme in order to make sure everyone's lending to the US. Now, with that massive capital inflows, you get to create a lot of stuff. And you can use your war in order to use their resources. So everything was built off the blood of everyone else's resources with their money in their poverty that came back to America, and they call it capitalism. All of these wars were about stopping competition. And capitalism requires competition. If you want an invisible hand, you need competition, because monopolies are not part of even Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations or even any classical economics. And then they went into Keynesianism anyway. Even Keynesianism they didn't do. That's another lie. Keynesianism says the government needs to subsidize to reach full employment in times of bad economies. And then you need to pay down the debt on the upside. They forgot the second half.
That's the part they forgot.
And they can't, because the dollar is debt. So if you pay down the debt, you get the Great Depression. So even Elon Musk pretending I'm going to create the Department of Government Efficiency in order to pay down the debt, what you're saying is we're going to crash the world. Because when the debt stops rolling over, the economy, the whole dominoes, there is no chair on the musical chairs. The debt has to increase forever. And Department of Government Efficiency was just a data exercise anyway. Anyway, going too far. That's the American economy. Now China said, okay, we're going to do a 100-year strategy, because we don't need to get elections every 2 years and start having left and right divides that distracts people from the reality that there is a corporate class that never changes. And this whole thing called democracy was actually a technocracy or a corporatocracy, whatever you want to call it, because they ruled all the way and they had consistent, just like China. But what they were able to do is rape the country of their manufacturing base by focusing the whole economy on financialization to roll over the Ponzi. Until eventually they owned everything. So they took every industry and made sure that you were paying the tax. In 1913, you got the introduction of income tax. There was no income tax before that. So they needed to use the income tax to pay the debt. Tax goes up. Inflation goes up. Those that own the assets end up beating inflation. Wages don't go up at the same rate. Massive wealth extraction.
That wasn't always the case, though. Like, I remember a time, at least 80s and up until about the early 90s in Australia, where we did have stronger worker representation in areas where individual workers did not have much bargaining power. And their wages kept up. Inflation was a collective problem then for government policymakers, because they couldn't simply put the burden onto people who were workers. They had to actually solve the structural issues underpinning inflation. But as that's become weakened, worker representation through unions has become weaker and weaker over decades. Same within America to a much larger extent. Workers weren't able to claw back through collective bargaining what they lost through inflation.
Yeah, and what do? You demonize it and say, hey, that's socialism and communism. That's what you do. You create it, that's the radical left. That's the Democrats, that's the Labours, that's the anti-capitalist movement. While at the same time, you're not following capitalism at the top of the power structure. You're following an elaborate debt-based Ponzi scheme that buys the politicians. And
it was only when I came to the UK that I found out that large corporations do wage price set by comparing. And the way they get away with it is saying, well, we're in the oil and gas industry, so an accountant in the oil and gas industry is not really vying for a job to be an accountant in the media industry, for example. And we know that's absolute nonsense because skills are transferable and happens all the time. But what they then do is they say, okay, well, you're a telecoms and we're an oil and gas company and you're a football club or a transport company. Let's compare how much we're paying based on years of experience and qualifications. And then what you're effectively doing then is you're signaling, because you can't do that in the market. You can't signal what you're willing to pay and what you're going to pay. And then that sets a standard that neither company will go above beyond a certain amount. So when you're in the market then looking for an accountant, you know how to set your prices based on all the other companies you've benchmarked against. And now what happens is there's another subset of there's another group also from various industries. So you might have 10 of these groups, all with the same sort of industry cohort made up, and they're all comparing with one another. Essentially what you're doing is you're price setting across industries for a particular skill set. And this happens for every single skill set across all industries. But then when you have a look at workers who want to go into the marketplace and bargain collectively, we call that socialism. And so how is it that one group is allowed to have this unfair advantage, but the other group is not able to level the playing field?
You've nailed it. America is a socialist country, but socialist for the rich. They get all the socialism. They get the bailout from the bank. They get price fixing. They get government Pentagon budgets. They get big, beautiful bills. They get the ability to borrow through quantitative easing in order to push up the price of their stocks. And they get to, basically, it is a socialist corptocracy in order to inflict their technology. And that's the lie. That's the lie. America is a socialism for the rich. Now you take a country like, let's give you an example. Saudi Arabia says, we managed to keep our oil, even though we had to give 50% to America. Once we were powerful enough, we managed to renegotiate that, and we didn't take it public. And what is Saudi and all these sovereign wealth funds? They're basically taking public companies and privatizing them so they can control them. And what they're doing is they're decolonizing by buying their freedom, because all of these assets were financialized, tokenized, and securitized, and now anyone can buy them. China can buy them. And that's how you end up in a scenario, by the way, where BlackRock is not America first, because they care about the American stock market. They care about capital markets. They care about using the dollar for as long as possible. They don't care about the people at all. And if there's more profits to be made there, then these are, quote unquote globalists. These are global institutions that have no allegiance to country. And those are the JP Morgans, and they got socialism because they control the politicians. And so you have got the very epitome. So what did China do? Well, China said, we went through a century of humiliation. We went through opium wars. We went through pillage. We went through rape. We went through a century of humiliation. And they said, we're going to create a century plan. And so through currencies, they essentially built their manufacturing base with their cheap labor. They used communism and central planning when they needed to. And they switched to capitalism, but they did a few things. And this is why capitalism and communism and socialism and all the isms are such a lie. There is a country, it has resources, and there are ways of optimizing those resources. You have a way of creating currency, and you can either create it for the people or create it for the private banks or create it as debt or create it debt-free. And you need a mechanism for having your currency. You have resources. You can either tax people, or you can say, we'll keep the oil, and because we build our wealth through our oil, you don't need to pay any taxes. And so Saudis don't pay taxes. They have some taxes, but they don't pay taxes. They keep all their money. Imagine how much better if, obviously Saudi is not capitalist because it is dealing, it is buying capitalism essentially through all these sovereign wealths and now acquiring assets to diversify their economy. But imagine how much better a capitalism could function if you weren't taxed, if you just got to keep your money. You'd invest your money in your business and your freedom, and you do a whole load of stuff. So capitalism, I think, functions a lot better if you take the resources under the ground and say, this is an alternative to tax. But we're told that's a no-go, that's socialism, that's communism, you can't do that. You have to tokenize it, securitize it, and financialize it, give it to, private. And what did America do? Essentially, America used a religious war of settler colonialism and genocide to take over the land, expel all the natives from the land so that they could take over the oil, and then the Rockefeller family had it, and then they used that to build the Federal Reserve with the partners of the European banks. But we're told that's capitalism. It's a lie. Everything's a lie. And where did you perpetuate these ideologies and these economic thought? Well, there was Islamic thought with the golden age of Islam. Then we had the funding of all these universities from the wealthy class. And those are now the largest endowment funds in the world. And so if you want to teach a doctor to be a doctor and instead you turn them into a drug dealer, then you control the syllabus. If you want to turn an economic social science into debt dealers, then you train these economists to work for the banks and the Fed. And the education system is a vital part of training minions to serve corporate interest as well. So even the education system and the political system and the socialization of bailout and government budgets, there's no, you're telling me that's an invisible hand? There is no capitalism in that at all. So China basically said, right, we'll do that. We'll build capitalism, but we won't allow a company to ever get bigger than the government. And we won't allow for the free flow of capital. Now, to us as a freedom and a Bitcoiner, that sounds like a nightmare, right? Authoritarian nightmare, no freedom of speech. I can't just take my Chinese yuan and convert it to Bitcoin easily. A nightmare, like in terms of the freedom that we value. But if you think about it from a Chinese perspective, they didn't want JP Morgan to take over their economy. And they said, Elon Musk, you will never become more powerful than the government. Jamie Dimon, you will never become more powerful than government. Larry Fink, you will never become more powerful than the government. And we want to protect our currency so that we can't be exploited by Western colonizers. The Chinese built the Great Wall of China to keep the barbarians out, not to colonize the world. They were the victims of opium wars. They were the people, they've had their colonial expeditions in the past. All empires go this route. But they essentially said, we want currency control so that they can't take over our currency and destroy us. We want to control capital flows. We want where the government is, the CCP is the ruling party. No corporation is bigger than us. And in exchange for that, 99% of Chinese people own their property. Almost all of them have got savings. They've got a bit of a consumption issue right now because people are savings. But
they've always seemed to have that, but it doesn't seem to impede their growth at all. So why is it a problem? Who says it's a problem?
Exactly. And now they've got so much reserves that they've built this Belt and Road Initiative that said, right, we've built the world's largest manufacturing base. We don't want to prevent competition. We want you to buy our stuff. So we're going to invest in your infrastructure because we want your country to be wealthy. Yeah, we may do a bit of a predatory deal, but this is nothing like the IMF. The IMF comes with austerity. It comes with predatory conditions. It comes with install a Western central bank that becomes a shareholder in the Bank for International Settlements. It comes with take this loan and you will give it back to us and you'll spend it on our products. And basically we're just printing some dollars and then giving it back to the companies that's going to be getting these contracts from you. And if you don't do everything we say, we're going to tell you have to install a liberal democracy. And we want to use your currency to devalue your savings and steal all your assets. And you're our bitch. That's what an IMF loan is.
It's like a loan from Tony Soprano, who sets the conditions so that you do default in order to be able to take over the assets that you have, your family home, and take it all over. And they set you up for failure, essentially.
Exactly. Now, China said, well, we want you to be rich so you can buy our stuff. And we're not going to tell you how to govern. We've got our own way of governing. You probably don't like our way of doing things. We don't like your way of doing things, but I don't care. We just want to make you wealthy so you can buy our stuff. And now they go into those countries in Africa and say, why don't you, we're taking some of your rare earth minerals and we're building these components, but why don't we invest in your infrastructure so you can have your own factory? And now you can actually build the next layer of the product up. And now you can actually maintain your wealth. And if you become wealthier, we can partner. And so everybody's taking Chinese money over IMF now.
Well, China's rise has been achieved without, have they started any wars in the last 40 years?
No, they have said we would take the territories that we believe are ours, which was Macau, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. But we definitely don't want to go to war. We just have a one China policy because those were our territories. Hong Kong was created when HSBC funded the opium wars, which was a drug dealing cartel to steal China's silver using India's resources and steal their gold. And you can do the same story with Macau and the Japanese wars and how that relates to Pearl Harbor and the embargo to steal all the oil that led to the creation of Taiwan. And they just said we want our territory. But we don't actually want to do it. They were, from my perspective, there's zero interest in reunifying with Taiwan. That's a Western story to justify militarizing Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, and the various island disputes there. Create a narrative of fear. If China ever reunified with Taiwan to get those silicon chips, and those chips are essential.
But they don't need them anymore. They're making their own.
They're making their own. No one can make them like Taiwan yet.
They're not far from that.
I agree they will get there. And now America's saying we need to be more like China. So Trump then says, okay, Biden said we'll put a $50 billion CHIPS Act to get TSMC, the Chinese Taiwan Manufacturing Corporation, over here. They're saying, well, if we give you our chips and China makes their own chips, then where's our national security? We want to be, we need you both dependent upon us. Otherwise, we've got no national security. Biden said, well, we'll put 50 billion and we'll persuade you. And then Trump said, okay, we're going to revive these zombie companies and do what China does. So we're going to become a shareholder in Intel. We're going to take some of that Biden money and $9 billion and try and revive Intel. But where's the cheap labor for this stuff? Where's the specialism? All right, we need AI and robotics. So everything in America now, the rebuilding of the manufacturing base, because America knows they lost the trade war. They did not wage a trade war. Tariffs was a recognition that China had already won the trade war. And the tariff policy was to draw everyone closer to BRICS and shrink America into a regional power. Who does Trump work for? The financial industrial complex. Who's the key player? Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is investing in BRICS. BlackRock is taking all of this money that's outflowing from American dollar denominated, which is weakening the dollar. The DXY has gone from 102 down to about $97. And it's capital outflow. It's being reinvested in these different industries. So Trump works for BRICS. And he paints a MAGA narrative saying that we're going to rebuild the manufacturing base and we're going to create the Department of War. And essentially, what tariffs did, it did three things. It took the American small business and medium-sized business and make it where they had to pay the tariff. The importer pays the tariff. What is America? America's the world reserve currency. The rule of world reserve currency, as per Triffin's dilemma, an economic concept, means that you have to have a twin deficit. It means you have to export dollars. You have to spend more than you bring in tax in order to push out that debt. And you need to import more than you export. And so you have these twin deficits, which is, that's how you create the dollar. And so if you try and reduce the debt or you try and reduce the trade balance, you crash the economy because you're no longer world reserve currency. So Elon Musk gave up on that and then just took all the data and integrated it into his artificial intelligence. And then the impact was that the importing country pays the tax. So now we're going to get this cycle where the small to medium sized business, they swallowed it initially. And what did BlackRock do? KKR has been record M&A activity. The large companies have been acquiring all the medium and small sized businesses in America, just like COVID. It was a massive consolidation of power. They do the same with Vietnam, all of the export-driven dependent countries. They acquire all of those, which have been impacted by it. The large multinational corporation, they just negotiate a deal because they got routes on both sides. They got a manufacturing base in China and they got a consumption base in America, and they can offset those deals and they can negotiate in order to have low impact. And then the medium-sized businesses, eventually, if they want to float, they have to put their price up. So you're doing fiscal dominance, printing money, you're doing tariffs, you're doing attack. And now the promise was, right, we're going to reduce the debt by tariff tax. How's that worked out? $350 billion in tax paid for by American companies. It was a tax on the American people then attacks on the American consumer because they're going to have to put their prices back. And Powell's reducing rates and Trump's trying to get him to reduce rates by 300 basis points, which has never been done in the whole Federal Reserve history. Also that they can roll over their debt. That's massively inflationary. And the other thing it did is it took every country and said, I'm going to now negotiate with BRICS and China. And so India went closer to BRICS. Russia, Iran, China created their way of circumventing sanctions. But, this all happened there. But the point of the tariff policy is that it was to reset the world order, and that's why they installed Trump.
Well, there are dozens of countries lining up to join the BRICS constellation of countries.
Including Palestine. And what did Saudi do? Saudi went to every European leader and said, Keir Starmer, Qatar, UAE, all of them started investing in European infrastructure. They did deals with Trump. Trump goes and brags it. What does it mean when Trump says $17 trillion is invested in America? Well, if it's Apple, then yeah, it's internal investment. That's good. It can build a factory, create jobs. That's awesome. But most of it's coming from foreigners. What does foreigners mean? Foreign direct investment. It means the returns go abroad. What is the IMF model? The IMF model is lend and acquire. So now Saudi is lending and acquiring, and China is lending and acquiring, and the UAE is lending and acquiring, and Qatar is lending and acquiring. Now suddenly, they've been able to buy freedom for Palestine. So UK, France said, we're going to recognize Palestine. And suddenly Portugal recognizes Palestine. Nothing to do with anything else other than Saudi said, how much does it cost us for you to recognize Palestine? What are we going to invest? Okay, we'll buy your country. We'll buy all of it. And who are they negotiating with? Essentially, who controls UK, Europe, America? They're negotiating with BlackRock and the BlackRock portfolio companies. So now you've got BlackRock negotiating over all the ports. You've got BlackRock that's using their KKR, private equity division to buy Thames Water. That deal fell through. And they're turning the entire West into AI data centers with AI and robotics. And they need water, they need land, they need manufacturing. And it ain't going to create any jobs. It's going to take away a lot of jobs. A lot of jobs.
I wish I shared your optimism on that front, but I don't think it matters that they've recognized Palestine as a state. If it did, they wouldn't have done it, especially the UK.
Yeah, so going into that one, let's take this framework of a proof of weapons network and try and deconstruct what we're happening. So one thing, once you know how the world works, here's what I think people find very hard. They think of countries in terms of countries. Now you've got to think in terms of power, okay? So the West, through JP Morgan and the financial industrial complex, is now controlled by BlackRock, the asset managers, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs. So, and then you have different factions. Think of the military industrial complex. It used to be aligned with a country. What's good for the dollar is good for America, and therefore let's create loads of war, and then the money comes back in dollars. But now, military is now cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. So now it's become the technical industrial complex, combined with the financial industrial complex is becoming like stable coins and tokenized real world assets in the future. So now you've got like these industries that used to be quite separate merging into finance, military, and technology and consumption. Amazon, and all these different force people to buy your goods. It creates demand for the dollars. And so when you're looking at Palestine, the way I think about it is the Gulf countries are negotiating their decolonization from America. Now, they look to the rest of the world that they're controlled by Israel, they're Zionist puppets, they're American bitches. But no, you've got to understand the flow of money. The flow of money is if a country invests in American assets, they become the IMF. So these countries, based upon the dollars that they built, are now buying their freedom because they built sovereign wealth. America is a debt-based Ponzi scheme. So they're making all of the investments, and what they're trying to persuade is the American military industrial complex to give up their forever war model. Their forever war model means they need Israel. Israel is a node of the proof of weapons network and a US colony. Their job is to make sure that the Middle East never gets powerful. Too late. They became powerful. Okay? So China comes along and says, I'm going to normalize between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That changes the game. There's three things you need in order to have peace in the Middle East. You need a US exit, you need Iran and Saudi Arabia to stop arguing, and you need Israel to stop being backed by the military industrial complex that would lead to a Palestinian state. China said, we'll do it. So China partnered with the GCC, normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran stopped supporting the Axis. The reason that Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis are not being supported anymore is because Iran went back. You had a theater called the 12-Day War, and that was a theater in order to allow America to walk away and said, we destroyed the nuclear program, which they didn't.
We are on the brink of a second attack on Iran that promises, from all indications, if we take the build up to the first attack, Israel's attack on Iran, and compare what's happening now, it looks like we are on the brink of a second attack that will make the first one pale into comparison. And the second thing I would ask you to comment on is, I thought the Gulf Cooperation Council, the countries, at least Saudi Arabia and perhaps a few others, they facilitated that first attack. They allowed their airspace to be used. They used their missile defense systems to intercept some of Iran's responses as well. Yeah, I guess I'd open that up for comment from you, because I can't reconcile the two.
Okay, I'd argue, and come back in a year, bookmark this and come back in a year. I'd argue that the 12-Day War was a theater agreed by all the regional powers, just as October the 7th was a chessboard reset operation. And it was October the 7th was absolutely, from my perspective, allowed to happen by Israel. And they wanted it to happen, and all the regional players had agreed on a game. And the game was ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, or we're moving to a new order that will recognize Palestine. The negotiation was, Netanyahu, in my perspective, doesn't represent Israel. Netanyahu represents the US military industrial complex, always has, always will. And Israel is essential when you have the forever war model in the Middle East. If you're not having the forever war model, then Israel is a toxic asset and a liability right now, because the world hates Israel because of the actions. We've watched a genocide in real time. Iran and its resistance was needed at a time when there was, Israel funding the forever war. And there was all the death to America chants because it knew that Israel was a US colony. And what it means is death to America in the Middle East. And that's what it actually means. And allow us to use our nuclear energy. We'll only build nuclear weapons if you keep surrounding us. And please leave our oil alone, British Petroleum. Stop installing and stop interfering in our economy and doing coloured revolutions. And Israel get out of the Middle East is essentially what that means. The 12-Day War. So Trump represents, I think, the financial industrial complex, the BlackRock's, the JP Morgans. He's a deal maker and he gets access to deals. Netanyahu represents the US military industrial complex. Right now, they're not in line. Finance profits from military because they lend the money. But after military comes rebuild. And after rebuild comes surveillance technology and rebuild contracts. And every type of contract we could get out of a peaceful Middle East. Imagine BlackRock trying to get as many assets as they can out of a peaceful Middle East. And America is retreating to regional power. It's no longer global hegemon. And Israel's not really needed in this equation. I would argue that the 12-day war, and again, come back in a couple of years and see how this worked out, was a reset of the chessboard where Iran got to say, we remain sovereign, and we actually bombed Israel, which previous to the 12-day war never would have happened. If Iran ever bombed Israel like that, America would be in, and we'd be in Iraq, and we'd be in a real war. Iraq was a real war. Iran 12-day war, that was a theater. Iran got to say, we held back the Zionists, and we're still here. Israel got to eliminate the hardliners that would never agree to a deal, and they assassinated the IRGC members that are very hardline. And America got to go back and say, guess what, to the Zionists, the evangelical Christians and the Zionists, we stopped the nuclear program and we saved Israel. Meanwhile, so everyone got to say they won. Okay? Then it ended. If it was a real forever war, it would be on right now and it would look like Iraq. Now, maybe there's a second round, or maybe we're leading to a crescendo of a deal and a negotiation. I'm not sure. It's hard to tell. But what we do know is that there is a plan, and that plan involves all the financial players in America. It involves the GCC and the different countries. And it involves what Saudi has always said for 25 years. We will not normalize with Israel until there is a Palestinian state. And they've been consistent to that for 25 years.
They were on the brink of normalizing, and in the background, even Netanyahu, he bragged about normalization and cooperation in the background, but officially they hadn't done it, and they were on the brink of doing that before October 7. And some say that precipitated, that catalyzed Hamas to act in that way so that the world would not forget Palestine.
But what was the condition of the normalization? It was conditional upon a Palestinian state. They've never deviated from that requirement. And yet, if Israel and America tell you something, it's because they want you to think that. So if the Western media says that they were on the verge of doing it, that's because they need you to think that they were on the verge of doing it. But the Middle East does not work without Palestine as a state. Iran is now powerful because it's normalized with, it's normalized with Saudi, and it's got this BRICS corridor that circumvents sanction and de-dollarization.
Is that a legitimate and sound rapprochement, I guess? Have they really buried the hatchet, for want of a better word? Have they really normalized relations? Because, they were quite adversarial for the longest time. And so the hope was that the deal mediated by China would be substantial. Do you have confidence in that?
I don't believe they're friends, but I do believe that they have a way of expelling US from the region that will be significantly better for the whole region. And the problem is with these forever war models is that Iran then built a network of profiting from and benefiting from destabilization. And you're trying to persuade Iran to stop doing that, while Saudi wants stabilization. And then Iran obviously is backing all the resistance against Israel. And you have these competing narratives, all these different narratives. Normalization to me is the process of recognizing, let's buy into a greater vision. Doesn't mean we like each other. Doesn't mean that we're friends. And even these 12-day war that I think was a theater, it doesn't mean that Iran signed off on killing citizens. They absolutely wouldn't. And they still hate each other, even if they agreed to a deal. This is game theory. And this is how geopolitics works. It's game theory. Sometimes you have to work with your enemies in order to get to a different type of game. And so I personally believe that Iran and Saudi have normalized. And October the 7th was meant to happen. What we are witnessing was an agreement from BlackRock, the military, to negotiate with the GCC to get as much assets out of the Middle East as they can, to eventually recognize Palestine, and have the GCC become the effective ruler of the entire Levant. And the Levant are the regions that were essentially destabilized because Iran funded resistance against occupation from Israel. You know, the Lebanons, the Yemens and stuff. Iran gets to be Iran, but it won't fund the resistance anymore because there's no need. Israel stops being backed by the military-industrial complex. Netanyahu, however, needs to negotiate his freedom. He doesn't want to go to prison. He'll probably end up in Argentina or Hungary or something eventually.
Do you think they'll give him up in a similar way to Serbia?
No. Netanyahu he's doing everything that the military-industrial complex want him to do. He is making them a shit ton of money out of genocide. They're preparing for the next war, which is escalation in Europe and Latin America. They get to move all their profits over there. America can come after its neighbors and make up for lost profits. And the financial industrial complex, and even Trump, he's going to build his Trump towers and all that stuff. He gets to profit from the Middle East that gets rebuilt. People find this very hard to believe, but I think by following the money, that's exactly where we're going. And all the moves that we have seen, while I am very bearish on the West, I'm very bullish on the Middle East, I'm very bullish on the global South. And that's all because China set up the chessboards in that way. And so my prediction is that there will be a state of Palestine. They won't be ethnically cleansed. And eventually there's going to be a rebuild contract, which is currently being negotiated. And maybe we need another Iran, Israel, America theater, but it won't be an Iraq war, and it definitely won't be World War III. That's my prediction. And the Middle East is going to come back at the end of this. And eventually in the next 5 years, I bet you Israel will be Arab majority, and the vast majority of radicalized Zionist hardliners will go back to America and back to Europe. The other ones that are genuinely interested in peace will stay.
That's a big call.
It's a big call.
What do you think is going to be the impetus for that? I mean, that's a huge call. What do you think will be the impetus for that?
I think we're witnessing it right now. I think the Qatar strikes was by Iran and Israel were 100% coordinated as well.
Between whom?
So Israel strike Qatar. They strike the office of Hamas. And now we've got the Hamas leadership that have left Qatar. And now we enter into negotiation deals, and Qatar is no longer on the hook for hosting Hamas. And they don't need to go back to their people and say, we betrayed the Palestinians. That was the end result. So they get to push their narrative. And then what happened? Qatar today signed a deal with US, which effectively means Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics, to buy weapons. So the military is saying, right, give us the deal here. Qatar, you buy this. Saudi, you buy this. And then we'll go focus on war in Europe and war in Latin America. And then the banks can then start rebuilding. And we're going to create AI data centers. We're going to create smart cities, surveillance state, Palantir technology. We're going to utilize your energy. Iran eventually will probably have nuclear energy rather than nuclear weapons. Obviously, there's water issues there. But I think the whole world, and this is pretty crazy, I know, but I think check in and see how well I did in a few years. I think the whole world is reconfiguring around this technology, AI, data centers, energy, semiconductor chips, Orwellian stablecoin, real world asset nightmare. And Trump on April the 2nd stood up in America outside and said, here's the tariffs, and it's Liberation Day. What actually everyone else heard was today's the day that we liberate ourselves from the dollar. I think the dollar gets weaker from here. I think de-dollarization becomes a thing. I think people build their gold reserves. I think Bitcoin becomes a weapon for negotiation in a multipolar world. I think artificial intelligence takes us to a world we've never seen in robotics. And I think that the energy of the Middle East is needed, and BlackRock is not America first, and Trump is not America first.
Well, peace and prosperity in the Middle East. We've got de-dollarization and perhaps a little bit of hope and opportunity with AI and robotics. I think that's a pretty good note to finish up this conversation. Simon Dixon, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.